For those men whose victims are minor-aged kids, and especially those whose victims are below the age of puberty, you will find that 100% of them are found to be in possession of child rape pornography, and about 98% are found to have also received charges for the distribution or dissemination, same thing, distribution or dissemination of that same material.
Is pedophilia starting to become normalized? I can't believe I just asked you that question, but today I'm bringing in an expert to discuss just that.
Again, different people mature at different rates.
I don't even know why I'm humoring you. No 12-year-old can possibly consent to sex with an adult. That's called pedophilia.
I think there are exceptions.
Okay, well,
I think exceptional 12-year-olds understand what consent is.
I think that's pure evil.
I think consent is, how do you define consent?
And I think you're probably not safe in society. That's what I think.
Let me ask you this. Do you subscribe to the popular notion that sex is harmful to children? That you would want to censor pornography from your children? You don't want them to see it. You think sex is evil.
100%. Pornography for children? You want children seeing pornography?
Have you read
any idea what pornography is doing to kids in this culture?
I think sex is not something should be vilified. I think a proper adult can educate their children about all the entanglements of sex.
Have you ever watched porn?
What do you think?
Do you know what's in porn?
You tell me.
The violence, the
Some
disgusting
kinds.
nature. You think,
Sure.
my gosh, why don't you just let kids be kids? How about that?
Again.
How about just let kids have an innocent childhood?
Again, the
they don't
dichotomy
even know
of
what
adult
sex
and child.
is until they're 12.
Again, we're going back to that dichotomy of
we
adult
don't
and child,
even-
and how do we define that definition?
God.
How do we actually define that edge?
All right. Nice talk.
Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and whether or not it's a clip like you just saw from child protection activist Billboard Chris, or maybe it's luxury fashion brands worn by the rich and famous openly promoting pedophilia like we saw with Balenciaga, or take a look at this performer right here from Argentina being applauded as he subjects his surrogate son to speaking out of a mic he's inappropriately placed. I'll give you one more example. It could be the everyday parents who are starting to scratch their heads and wonder whether or not their local library has become a den for child groomers who are obsessed with normalizing the drag queen industry and entertainment for children. There are people starting to wonder whether or not there is an agenda at play that is seeking to normalize pedophilia. And since at Rebel News we bring you the other side of the story that you won't see on the state-backed media, I'm bringing you an expert who's qualified to give his opinion on that. His name is John Euler. He has over 30 years' experience working with people who have severe trauma from being sexually assaulted, but not just that. He also works as a therapist for those who are the sexual offenders, and that includes pedophiles. But first, if you appreciate that Rebel News covers this important topic, and by the way, it does not pay a lot to do so, please consider supporting our journalism by opening up another tab and going to rebelnews.com and donating what you can. Here's Mr. Euler.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. John Euler. You're coming here with a wealth of wisdom in some pretty serious areas of society, whether that be people who have experienced severe trauma from sexual abuse or sexual assault, all the way to working with sexual offenders and troubled youth. So thank you for being on Rebel News.
It's a pleasure. I appreciate you having me.
Now, I wish this wasn't the topic, but it seems to be rearing its ugly head in so many different ways. It kind of started off as what seemed like a conspiracy. You would see people saying, oh, they're going to normalize pedophilia. And you would hear about MAP, minor attracted persons. But, as things like drag queen story time and some of the sexually explicit and books running around in schools and things like that start to become more prevalent and at the surface, you've got to wonder what's going on. So I guess what I wanted to say is, what is your professional opinion? Do you think that pedophilia is starting to be normalized? And if so, when did this start to happen?
Maria, I would say there's no question. That is the goal. For a significant percentage, in my estimation, of those that are pushing what I call the trans deception. You have a lot of different special interests, big pharma, big medical, greedy, unethical surgeons that are happy to whack off body parts. We don't want to believe that, and that's all it takes for a psychopath. There are two kinds of psychopaths. One is a bloody psychopath. That's what comes to our minds initially when we hear the term. But there's a white-collar psychopath. We find a lot of those in politics, in finance, anywhere, everywhere, right? In academia, in psychology, in education, law enforcement, everywhere, unfortunately. The psychopath really is three things. That'll set the stage for then understanding that there is a huge push to normalize it. A psychopath has no conscience. That is the best way to understand psychopathy. It's a slippery slope. You go down far enough, violating your conscience, and you become very different, and therefore you lose the ability and the desire and the interest to ever be sorry. So you lose the ability to be sorry. So you have no remorse and then no empathy. You don't care about the impact. All the other facets of a psychopath are layered on top of that. You can have financial psychopaths, medical psychopaths, sexual psychopaths. Oftentimes there's overlap. When someone gets into sexual psychopathy, and there's a difference between men and women, my primary focus has been men. I am a certified sex offender treatment provider. I'm certified in the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. I have probably close to 15,000 clinical contact hours dealing with men who have sexually offended, spent over 11 years in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections on psychology staff, working with the full range of criminals and criminal minds, but also sex offenders. Headed up one of the state's high-intensity standalone 65-bed units, or 65-bed unit specialized for sexual violent predators. So I really understand this realm very well. People need to understand that the further a man goes down the slippery slope of pornography, quite frankly. So prior to pornography, you've always had deviance that follows a very predictable path. Ever since pornography and the internet, you will never find a sex offense. I would say it's safe to say, certainly in the 80s, I would say in the 70s, but ever since pornography, you will not find, let's say by the 80s, because I can definitively tell you, in the year 2005, when I started in the prison system, I started to do a deep dive into records. So in this day and age, you will never find a man that has sexually offended who is not deeply steeped in pornography prior to offending. So pornography is the common denominator among all sexual offenses. For those men whose victims are minor-aged kids, and especially those whose victims are below the age of puberty, you will find that 100% of them are found to be in possession of child rape pornography, and about 98% are found to have also received charges for the distribution or dissemination, same thing, distribution or dissemination of that same material. By the time a man offends a child, there's very predictable stages and categories of pornography that he will have progressed through. And the public needs to understand this, because the persona and the face of the pedophile that we are shown is a very mild-mannered, sensitive guy. And we're told myths, by the way, that a pedophile is someone that has trauma in his own background. He chooses a victim at the same age that he himself was offended. And so he's working out this psychodynamic trouble. That is not true, by the way. By the time a man is arrested, finally busted, the kind of pornography he is arrested with will inevitably include bestiality. And they don't want people to know that. Why? Because the little narrative goes out the window. Once people find out that pedophiles, prior to becoming pedophiles, I emphasize that, prior to becoming a pedophile, they started with adult pornography, or a pornography that focused on adults. It transitioned into what's called barely legal. Best way to view it is like an hourglass. It comes down to a certain point. That point is what's called barely legal. If a man doesn't turn back from that, he will continue. At barely legal, you have adult, we'll say, the target audience is men, so you have adult women that are looking like baby dolls, looking very young. And you have young children that are dressed to look older. So it all converges around age 13. Isn't that interesting? They call that barely legal. It's not.
Yeah.
If a man continues down, then the additional things he is accessing and will start to access is extremely heinous. The one step beyond child pornography is snuff porn. In Canada, the citizens of Canada should be very, very concerned, because just recently, with the push for bills to expand euthanasia, in my estimation, it is the perfect opportunity now to silence the lambs. People don't understand that a lot of sexual abuse victims will take the secret to the grave rather than disclose. So you can have the predation of young kids that end up becoming teens that show all sorts of mental health issues, which is my concern anyways about the trans movement. You have a large population of very vulnerable kids that have significant mental health issues. The majority of those kids have been sexually abused, or they're on the autism spectrum, or they're being influenced by social media or social contagion. They have a difficult time with their intuition, which allows them to reality test. Perpetrators, predators, manipulators, since they have no conscience, the only thing that is left to stop them from crossing boundaries is the other person. The mechanism that is designed to protect you from somebody who doesn't care any longer is your intuition, the thing that says, hey, wait a second, something's up with this. A manipulator, abuser, perpetrator, they will all begin to work on you to cause you to dispense with your intuition, to turn the volume down on your intuition so that you don't trust yourself, so that you second guess yourself. And then their famous phrase, delivered either literally or in one way or another, they will say, well, Dre, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. And at that point, the question is, who are you going to believe? Now, with the grooming that's taking place through Drag Queen Story Hour and these other methods, furries is another one that parents really need to understand. Those are the big mascot-like costumes that hide 100% of an adult's identity. I mean, you have no clue who you're handing your child over to. I first learned about furries from pedophiles in prison, saying that was their favorite method of grooming.
And I see that there's some, stuff online saying, oh, furries isn't like a real thing. It's not a thing that's linked to pedophilia. So it's interesting that you learn about it through offenders.
That's right. It's an extremely deviant group, right? That the majority, even in their own research, if you can believe furries has their own research, I think about 96% of those that responded say that they are regularly, on a regular basis, accessing pornography, including furry porn. Okay, that's almost 100% of that community And about 17% on a regular basis access bestiality. So if you allow your minor child to get involved in furries, you can be guaranteed that they will be accessed at some point in time, sooner rather than later, by a pedophile. There's a huge push to circle back around to the question. There's a huge push now, especially led by academics, to make it seem reasonable, to make it seem intellectual. There's a huge push to normalize, to destigmatize, and ultimately to legalize pedophilia.
But I wonder, since you're in contact with people who are sexual offenders and you have that those sort of conversations with them, have you had any conversations with them about some of the things people are concerned are normalizing pedophilia or grooming, such as drag queen story times or the books that are sexually explicit in school? And if you have discussed that with them, what are their thoughts on that?
Their thoughts really come down to this. They cannot believe how naive parents are. Perpetrators now can do, in a fairly safe way, what used to run the risk of getting 5 to 10 years in prison. They can now easily walk into the women's locker room and shower room, restroom, bathrooms. How do they do that? Dress in women's underwear and drag. The average person who hasn't worked around sex offenders, and prior to working with them, I would not have guessed. We somehow think that they have a bottom line that they wouldn't cross. Almost like we would say, well, no self-respecting sex offender would ever dress in women's clothing. Really? When you have men that are pushing to be on women's sports teams, the public thinks it's because they want to win medals. What the public doesn't understand is they don't care about the medals. These guys are on the women's sports team to deny women, because as a man sinks lower and lower into pornography, he develops a malevolence toward women. Two things will happen. He develops a malevolence toward women, and that's why you see the abuse of women increases. The further a guy gets into more of this heinous stuff, it moves from attraction to lust to deviance. Let me describe what deviance is, because this is very important for people to understand. Deviance is once a man enters into that realm and it's progressive. He no longer is normal. His mind, his brain is changing. Psychology comes along when he uses the term psychopathic. He's developing a psychopathic mind. The white matter, gray matter still kind of look the same, but the way his brain processes is very different now, because what his appetites, his drives, his desires are becoming inverted. Instead of loving people and using things, it's now about objectifying. And a deviant man can only become sexually excited when he knows he's having a negative impact upon the woman or the child. And certainly with a child, no man is attracted to a child's body. It's all about having a negative effect. So scarring and marring and warping the heart and the mind and the soul of that child, about leaving a lasting impact. That's why, by the way, sex offenders, pedophiles, have no problem being castrated, chemically castrated, if that allows them to get out of prison, because it's not about hormones and it's not about age that helps, that makes sense of a pedophile who offends. It's about deviance. The thing that they get off on, using that term, is the negative impact, and that's why they will use objects to perpetrate against their victims. So it's not normal sex and sexuality. People need to understand that. So for these men that want to go on to women's sports, men in women's prisons, these men are desiring to have a negative impact upon these women. In women's sports, it's all about gaining access to private spaces. That's the same reason why these men want into women's rape shelters. It's about traumatizing, and it's about conquering.
Well, I think this is a very important topic. I guess a lot of people watching, or some people, would say, well, you're certainly painting all of these people with the same brush. So just for clarification, are you saying that every, trans person that goes into women's spaces is doing so in this fashion? Or do you believe some of them are suffering from gender dysphoria and genuinely want to be perceived as a woman?
I'll take a step back and clarify something. From my perspective, it's controversial, but I don't care because I've been in the field of counseling for 30 years. There's no such thing as a trans person. Now, before everybody shuts off, right, what I'll say is this. There are people, and you have people that can become confused, people that feel the effects of molestation, or people that have men who've deeply steeped themselves in pornography. So you have people. You have men and women based upon chromosomes who are either confused, being influenced. So there's no such thing as a trans person. You go back prior to 2005 and you won't see that. Okay? So when a man dresses in women's underwear and drag to enter a woman's private space, he's already deeply steeped in pornography. So you have a biological male who's filled his mind with deviant pornography. How can I say it? With the amount of men in this day and age that access pornography, who has not been deeply steeped in years' worth of pornography. For me, it's a safety issue for women and children. Is it safe to allow a man, I don't care how he's dressed, who has accessed hours and hours in pornography into private spaces with women and children? My background working with men who have sexually perpetrated, and what do we call a man a day before he was arrested for sexual perpetration? We call him a pre-arrested sex offender. What is he like the day before he offended? Typically, he was like a normal person that nobody suspected. We now, in this day and age, have an issue that has come up multiple times about two men that happen to be partners or married, two guys. They want to be foster parents or adoptive parents or now surrogate parents. Yet we're finding in multiple cases that these two men are child trafficking. It is not safe, in my estimation, given how many men access pornography, to allow kids to be placed with men. But if a man is evidencing the impact of sexual deviance, it is certainly not safe. For public safety matters, if we care about the safety of women and children, it really comes down to this. What takes priority, the sensitivities of men or the safety of women and children? That, for me, is what it comes down to. I do not care about the sensitivity of men, quite frankly. They can deal with it when it comes to the safety of women and children. And that's what society needs to understand is being compromised. Women and children are being placed at risk by allowing men who clearly give evidence that they've been accessing pornography for a long period of time to have access to the same spaces that these women and children are in. It's not safe.
If you are tired of the sexual agendas that seem to be coming at our children from all angles, do something about it. And it only takes less than a minute. Go to our special website called stopclassroomgrooming.com. teach kids their ABCs and math and leave them alone. Again, that is stopclassroomgrooming.com. Close to 10,000 people have already signed that petition to stop that from happening in Canada, and we hope that you join them.